It is April 2nd, 2025. And now, not only is Trump threatening to bomb Iran if they don't agree to a nuclear deal on his terms, but you also have Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordering the Pentagon to send an additional aircraft carrier as well as other air assets to the Middle East, raising a lot of questions about what the Trump administration could have planned, whether they are actually planning a strike on Iran and what that could mean for the region. And then we also have the question, are we going to see any meaningful talks? And is the elephant in the room going to be raised? Because if we want to talk about Iran and the potential of them having nuclear weapons or concerns about them obtaining and creating a nuclear weapon, then maybe we should start talking about Israel because they are the one that actually has nuclear weapons and that is openly holding the region hostage right now. And nobody in the international community really wants to talk about it. We got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Patrick Henningsen, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and host of the 21st Century Wire. Patrick, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
It's great to be with you, Rachel.
Now, I want to get into the latest here as we have the tensions between really the Trump administration and Iran soaring once again. You've got Trump openly threatening Tehran in an attempt to try to force them into what seems to be a version of the nuclear deal that he, of course, pulled the U.S. out of back in 2018. And now not only is the U.S. bombing Yemen, but the Pentagon also announced on Tuesday that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had ordered the deployment of an additional aircraft carrier and more U.S. assets to the Middle East. So, how do you see the current tensions and what the Trump administration is really going for here?
No, they're clearly escalating. So they're planning for a long campaign, bombing Yemen, of course, for the Yemenis, for the Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis. They're used to it. They've been basically under bombardment from the U.S. proxies, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for the better part of a decade. That war that was begun by Barack Obama in March 2015. That's almost 10 years, almost to the day. Last week, 10 years ago. So the Yemenis are prepared for that, but the U.S. is now trying to escalate to posture that they're going to launch an attack on Iran. And so this is where things are getting really kind of dicey now, because Donald Trump has threatened the Iranians. Basically, if you don't come to the table and negotiate a nuclear deal, we're going to strike you, a preemptive strike. Okay. Now, if you look at Trump's own nuclear doctrine, it includes low yield tactical nuclear weapons, ground penetrating bunker busters. So effectively, what is being said, which is not being discussed, is a preemptive nuclear strike on Iran. Okay. That's not a small thing. Okay. So why is this? Because, well, Israel wants the U.S. to make Iran negotiate not only its civilian nuclear power industry, but also their missile program. Okay, that's the back end of this that nobody's talking about. Obviously, that's what it is. There's no evidence that Iran has any nuclear weapons. They are a nuclear threshold state, which means that they have the potential, should they choose to assemble a nuclear weapon, and they can do so within weeks, or within a month, or within weeks probably. So, but they're not the only nuclear threshold state in the world. There's others that have the same capability, but the U.S. isn't threatening any of those countries. Okay, they're just threatening Iran. So this idea that somehow Iran is a threat to U.S. security is not true. The only perceived country that perceives them as a threat in the region, in realistic terms, is probably Israel. Okay, the Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, they're actually engaging in some kind of rapprochement brokered by China recently. So unless the U.S. preempts a war, then all of those Gulf states will become targets for an Iranian retaliation because they have U.S. bases in them. But as it stands, without the U.S. instigating a conflict, the Gulf states are fine. with Iran. They want to have a stable and prosperous region. Everybody agrees on that except for one country, of course. So this is where it's at. So what does this mean in terms of the United States? Is Trump really going to get anywhere with this type of approach? I don't think so, because there is hardly any example in history where this is basic game theory, by the way. If you study to be a diplomat or you're into negotiations, not real estate deals in Atlantic City, but treaties and things like that, real things, right? The business of nations, not the business of property developers in the tri-state area, okay, or golf courses in Florida. We're talking about bigger things here. And game theory shows, not suggests, shows that if a country is threatening another target country with collective punishment or violence or an attack, either at that moment or later down the road, the chances of them complying with whatever conditions are being imposed is almost zero. Okay, that's every single case study in history plus every theoretical model. And I had to study that for my postgraduate in international relations. That was required reading, basics. And every single person on the diplomatic corps of the last previous presidencies probably knew this as well. But this is a different kind of group of people now. These are people with no diplomatic experience who don't know anything of what I just explained to you, have no idea what I'm talking about, and they're in charge of making policy. And they think they can wing it and do it on the hoof, and everything's going to be fine because everyone fears America. That's basically the gunboat diplomacy. So they're trying to turn the clock back to 1920 and think that somehow this is going to be, the world's, this is not 1920. You have a number of other nuclear states. You have Iran itself is a capable, formidable military power with thousands of hypersonic missiles. And while the U.S. could do extreme damage to them, no doubt, with such an attack, Iran could also do damage to U.S. facilities in the region, U.S. allies in the region, and Israel itself. The question is, the political price that the U.S. will pay for that, both domestically and internationally, is that something that the Trump administration have factored in to their current posture? I'm not talking about the X's and O's of military force, nuclear weapons, advantages on in space and in the air and so forth. No, I'm talking about the political calculus, because that's part of that should be part of the calculation. If things go haywire in the region and the region and the world descend into a bigger conflict, who's going to get blamed for it? Not the Iranians. It's going to be Donald Trump and the U.S., and that's how history will be written. If you think about how much hate people have for George W. Bush, how long ago was that? 20 years ago? Tony Blair and Bush are reviled by most of the global population as warmongering, war criminals, and deceitful people. They'll go down in history hated forever. And if you think about how bad that is, what Trump is stepping into is he will be hated that much times 10. That's his legacy. And that'll be the U.S. position. So the U.S. will then go into a different category internationally. They're already veering towards that sort of public enemy in the global community, but they'll really firmly be there. And then what happens at that point? Are we in a better, more stable, safer world, or are we in a more dangerous, unstable, and not so prosperous planet at that point? And you need to think about these things.
Yeah, it really is incredibly concerning to watch the direction that the Trump administration is going in, especially when Trump is someone who campaigned on this promise of peace, right? He's always talked about ending the endless wars. If you're going to start a war with Iran, that's an endless war right there. And it's one that is going to have major repercussions, as you were pointing out there, that the US is going to feel those repercussions early on. It's not like years down the road we start to see the blowback. No, that comes into play a lot earlier. Now, when you look at Iran's response to all of this, they have refused direct talks, but said that they're open to indirect talks. And we also heard from the Iranian UN ambassador who lodged a formal complaint with the UN Security Council, calling Trump's threats reckless and belligerent, and an egregious violation of international law. He also said that Tehran strongly warns against any military adventurism and will respond swiftly and decisively to any act of aggression or attack by the United States or its proxy, the Israeli regime, against its sovereignty, territorial integrity, or national interest. So, how do you view Iran and the way that it's responded? I mean, it has shown a lot of patience, especially with Israel and with the United States as well. But how do you view the position that Iran is currently in?
Well, it is kind of disturbing because just a couple of days ago, the senior advisor to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, I believe his name is Ali Larijani. He's a senior advisor. He made the statement that the current fatwa that Iran has for a prohibition on nuclear weapons, they're prepared to reverse or lift that if they continue to get existential threats of annihilation from the United States, that they will reverse their policy, which is no nuclear weapons. So that's the supreme leader's senior advisor. He wouldn't say that publicly if this is not a very big possibility. So once again, you have the US doing things to push the situation away from a good situation to a worse situation. This is what they did with Yemen. The Yemenis were not bombing or interdicting any ships. They hadn't done anything. There was a ceasefire in Gaza. Yemenis stopped, predictably, like they said they would. They did what they said they were going to do, and they hadn't resumed. But then Israel and the U.S. broke the ceasefire in Gaza and blocked off food, water, medical aid to the Palestinians in Gaza. So the Yemenis then made an announcement and said, we are going to resume our sanctions and are basically interdicting Israeli shipping and interest going through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and the Red Sea. And before the Yemenis then resumed action, the U.S. hit them militarily hard. And so what did that do? It stopped shipping. It's cost the Egyptians and the Europeans more money. It's created a war footing in the region. So the U.S. they broke the ceasefire, and then they attacked a person who they said was the problem. They made the problem persist and continue. So you get the opposite effect from everything the U.S. claims to be doing stuff to stop or stabilize, but they do the opposite. So this is a problem, because if obviously that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if Iran does assemble a nuclear weapon. But look at the other countries in the region. The Pakistanis have nuclear weapons. That they're right next door to Iran. India has nuclear weapons. They're not far from Iran. Does Iran feel threatened by Pakistan or India having nuclear weapons? No, not at all. Is there any chance of nuclear war breaking out between Pakistan and India? No, probably not. Most experts are saying the situation is balanced because they both have nuclear weapons. So if Iran is supposedly a threat to Israel, and Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, and the U.S. is threatening to bomb Iran because they might want nuclear weapons, and the country that the U.S. is acting on behalf of has a nuclear arsenal, Israel, 200 to 300 nuclear warheads, undeclared. No inspection, no non-proliferation treaty, nothing. So this double standard is so gaping right now. And now is the time when maybe it's a good time for the international community to start asking Israel why it won't allow international inspectors and to know how many warheads they have and so forth. How could Iran want to engage in any meaningful discussion after Trump torched the JCPOA? And now Israel is a full-on, fully blown nuclear state. They're not subject to any oversight, and they're wanting to basically hold Iran accountable for something it might do in the future. This whole thing is just totally out of control. So I think there's a potential solution that can be had right now.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring that up, because if I were Iran and I'm looking at Israel right now, and then I'm looking over at the Trump administration, they seem to be giving Israel the green light for essentially whatever it wants, short of direct war with Iran right now. And despite all of this fear mongering, as you were also pointing out there, we have to look at Iran's ambitions, what we've heard from them so far. And we did notably hear from Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard last week when she testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee and said that the intelligence community continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. So if Tulsi Gabbard is coming out and saying, look, we're paying attention to everything that Iran is doing, we're not seeing evidence of this, and then the US is still, Trump is still trying to threaten Iran into a corner, then when it comes to, okay, what is some sort of, deal that could be made, as you were pointing out there, Israel needs to be involved in the sense that Israel needs to have the exact same transparency that Iran and that every other nation is supposed to have. When it comes to the possibility of making another deal, how do you see it? Because I know that Israel is not going to be offering themselves up for international inspectors anytime soon. So, is there a possibility of a deal that Iran would actually agree to based on what we know so far?
There is a possibility, and I wrote my proposal for that and put a summary of it on Twitter, on X. Okay, I've road tested this with Iranian journalists and people working in the government and in media, as well as other countries, and the reaction I got from the Iranians was very positive on this. They said they would accept such a deal, as well as other people in the Middle East, which is this: another JCPOA, but not just Iran, but Israel as well. And then once that transparency happens, then there's no choice, but Israel has to be disarmed, because you can't, if we're being transparent, you can't have one country with a nuclear arsenal that can hold the rest of the region hostage or extort nuclear blackmail and extortion. It's not acceptable. But that can't happen until there's that first step of transparency. Or Iran is allowed to, if Israel will not give up their nuclear weapons and account for, they have to account for them, but if they don't want to give them up, then Iran should be allowed to have nuclear weapons. And I think that would balance the situation out perfectly fine. And then we can get to real negotiations at that point. Because right now it's completely lopsided. There's a double standard that's just it's impossible to overcome, with Israel being allowed to have a secret nuclear weapons arsenal. Okay. Not only that, if you want to treat a true nuclear-free Middle East, then the United States must remove its nukes from the region, including Incirlik Air Force Base in Turkey and others, because it's the Cold War's over. The Cold War, check your calendar. 35 years. Why do we have roving nuclear deterrent in every single corner of West Asia? It's ridiculous. The Soviet Union's not there. It's not a threat unless the US wants to maintain that deterrence, because they now feel that Russia is a threat. Why would Russia be a threat to the United States? What has the US done recently that might make Russia think that it might be a threat? You can see how all of this fits together. And we can't have any meaningful discussions going forward on any of these big issues unless everybody is open, about what their situation is. And Israel is being allowed to have a different standard for what it does, and then demanding that everybody else comply to some high level of disarmament and things like that, so that they don't feel threatened. Well, what about Iran? What about the rest of the region that will be embroiled in a conflict between Israel and Iran? What about their safety? What about the fallout from nuclear weapons that Israel has for the other Gulf states and Arab countries in the region? It's unacceptable. So this is an opportunity, even if Israel doesn't comply, just a mere fact that this subject now becomes a discussion point I think could transform the other negotiations regarding Palestine and the occupied territory and so forth. So it could be like a step towards being a little more honest, which is something that Israel hasn't been made to do, and the United States either, because they're hiding so much. And that kind of has to end at this point. This crisis is an opportunity to move forward on a lot of these things that have been stuck. It's been kind of frozen and I think it's a good opportunity. Whether the Iranians take this opportunity to make this an issue, I think they will. I think they are going to make it an issue. I think Russia could make this an issue as well, in the interest of peace, in the interest of stability, transparency. I think it's a good thing. So we'll see.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see as you're pointing out there, and I'm thinking about the Donald Trump factor in all of this, right? You got this guy who, again, he campaigns on peace and then he gets right back into office. And if you look at the way that he is handling things, I mean, if you're Iran or you're Russia, you're looking at Trump and you're going, we can't trust this guy because we just watched him brag about being the champion of the ceasefire in Gaza and then turn right back around and not only allow that to fall apart, but give Israel his blessing to restore its bombardment and blockade of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and then take it a step further and to have the US start bombing Yemen and to increase the US military presence in the region. So when it comes to how trustworthy or untrustworthy Trump is in this case and his kind of flip flopping all over the place, do you expect to see, I guess, any meaningful progress during his term? Or is there still that major concern there that he could turn around tomorrow and say, all right, okay, we're going to bomb Iran. And then we're having a completely different conversation because now we're having to deal with the fallout of that and potentially a massive war that just sets the entire region on fire.
Problem is that the Trump administration wants the rest of the world to change how they do diplomacy to cater to the Trump administration and how they want to do business. And this is not going to work. This is not how the world works. And you know, Republicans and MAGA might be trashing the United Nations all the time. Oh, we should defund the UN. Oh, we need to pull out of the UN. There's the globalists and all this other stuff. Look, it's the only forum that is available right now. Okay, so it's all that we have to work with. It's failing in a large part because of the United States. Okay, so they need to come back to the table and try to work through some of these issues with other countries. Otherwise, things are going to continue to deteriorate. This idea that the Trump administration is somehow anti-war or that he's somehow a peace president, I think we can kind of jettison that idea now. I think it's gone. To go and wage war against one of the poorest countries on the planet, Yemen, in order to protect your ally so that it doesn't have to stop committing genocide and ethnic cleansing while they're in the world court for international courts of justice for genocide, while their prime minister has an arrest warrant out with the International Criminal Court, whether you agree with it or not. The evidence is like overwhelming in both of these cases. So there's no question there. That's where the U.S. has basically put all of its chips. This is not a winning gambit. And by the way, if we want to be truthful, okay, this idea that Trump, there was no wars under the first Trump administration, it's not true. He continued Obama's proxy war against Yemen when he came into office. He could have stopped it. He kept it going, in fact, ramped it up, right? And so he did that. He put boots on the ground in Syria, Donald Trump, 2017. And they occupied 25% of Syria. They're still there to this day. They stayed through the Obama administration. Trump hasn't wound that operation down at all. So that's another one. Okay. He provided lethal aid to the Ukrainians and escalated the conflict in Ukraine against Donbass. And that has led to this escalation and war that broke out in 2022, February of 2022. Donald Trump did more than Obama did in terms of escalating with lethal aid and weapons and javelins, which he boasts about. And I'll add one more. The Jolani regime that marched, HTS, that marched into Damascus in December, Al-Qaeda, okay? Al-Qaeda. Donald Trump saved them in Idlib. The Syrian Arab Army with Russian air cover, Hezbollah, Iranian forces on the ground. They were ready for a counteroffensive against HTS, al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in Idlib. And Donald Trump intervened, threatened to bomb Damascus, and then Turkey came in, said they were going to work with the U.S. to resolve the 30,000 terrorists in Idlib. They didn't do it. They stabbed Syria and Russia in the back. And Trump boasted about it in 2019. He said, I saved Idlib. So that thing you saw in Syria, right now we're seeing, massacres, pogroms against religious minorities, Alawites, Christians. Donald Trump's responsible for the survival of Al Qaeda in Syria. He bragged about it. Okay, so he's responsible, and the Abraham Accords, which many experts believe accelerated October 7th, wouldn't have happened if not for Trump's supposed peace plan, the Abraham Accords. So let's just put to bed all of this talk about how Trump is a man of peace and he is no new wars. It's patently false. And you can now see that in the behavior and the negotiation style that's very reckless and disrespectful and completely writes off other countries, leaders and governments and diplomats, just ignoring them, disrespecting them, treating them like they're sort of, lesser entities and not listening or not caring what other people. So all he's left with at this point is go ahead and, wage war on the Eskimos in Greenland. Go invade, go shoot some penguins in Greenland. Yeah, there's a W for you there, Trump. But everything else is an L. Rubio has fumbled in Ukraine, fumbled in Gaza. They're fumbling with Iran, one L after another. That's not what Trump ran on, and it's not what the American people elected him to do. So they really need to have a reckoning. And I think having a Fox News weekend host as your defense secretary with no experience, who the highest rank he as a reservist attain the rank of major, and you're putting him in charge of the Pentagon and foreign policy, a Fox News weekend host, not even an anchor. At least it was an anchor.
I know.
Fox and Friends. It's a joke. This is not. These are not serious people. They're not. And Trump is not running a serious administration. Not in the foreign policy realm. I can tell you, Mike Waltz is not a qualified national security advisor, and you can see the results. Marco Rubio is not a qualified Secretary of State. He's hiding in Guyana right now. While everything else is going on in the world, Marco Rubio is hiding in South America, in like Guyana or something like that. Why? Because it's failure after failure after failure everywhere else. So that's kind of like, I'm being honest. Like that's how I see the situation. I think it's a disaster so far, and it could get worse if they don't hit the brakes and have a real sort of epiphany that they are absolutely on the wrong track here and being led by Israel up the garden path. Things could get really bad. And this is not good for anybody, not Europe, not the US, not Russia, not China or anybody, let alone the Middle East. Let's not even talk about that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It is very concerning to watch the direction that they're going in. And as you were pointing out there, the team that Trump has assembled, this is the guy who he said that, one of his biggest mistakes during his first term was surrounding himself with the wrong people. And I'm looking at the people he has surrounded himself with in his second term, and I'm going, okay, well, are these supposed to be the right people, right? Is this take two where you get everything figured out? I don't even know. But I do think for the Americans who are watching this conversation, they really need to keep in mind, hey, Trump needs to be held accountable for the decisions he's making right now. As you were laying out before, it's like Iran is not a threat to the United States, right? Or Israel may claim that they view them as a threat, but they are not. Iran is not threatening the U.S. homeland, which is what our national security is supposed to be all about. Yemen is not threatening the U.S. homeland, and the list goes on and on. I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and a lot of us kind of watching in trepidation to see what in the world the Trump administration is going to do next. But I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Patrick Henningsen, a journalist, geopolitical analyst, and host of the 21st Century Wire. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.